Well, hello there, St. Philip's family. We are back with our story, our parable of the 10 virgins. If you missed it yesterday, we're looking at Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. And we are really a Bible-based church. We really encourage you to be reading your Bibles daily. So if you haven't read this passage yet, why don't you catch up right now, hit pause. We're in Matthew 25, verses 1 through 13. Seriously, go ahead and hit pause. And go and read the verse, and then I'll wait for you, and we'll come back and we'll catch up. Okay, so if you remember, we were talking about Jewish weddings and what usually happened. We were talking about who these girls are and what usually happens. They go out, and they're waiting to meet the bridegroom at a certain place. That's one of their responsibilities, and then they process to the wedding. So what happens in this story is the 10 girls, they go and they wait for the bridegroom, like we said, and 5 of them bring extra oil, and 5 of them don't. They don't have any extra oil at all. They become drowsy while waiting, and they fall asleep. Now, at midnight, or sometimes it's translated in the middle of the night, there's a cry that the bridegroom is coming. And they all wake up, and they all trim their lamps. Except the foolish girls notice that their lamps are going out. They're pretty much running on fumes. And they demand that the other girls give them some of their extra oil. And the wise girls basically say, that's not really a good idea. If we give you some of our oil, what's going to happen is we're all going to run out of oil during the procession. That won't be a good thing. You need to go and buy some oil for yourselves. Now that might not sound very nice, not sharing, but you see, this isn't a parable about sharing. It's a parable about preparedness, about being ready. And they had a point. I mean, how embarrassing would it be if halfway during the procession, all of their lamps went out? It wouldn't be very respectful to the bridegroom. So what ends up happening is the bridegroom comes while the foolish ones are gone to buy oil. Now, the wise girls, who Jesus says were ready, process with the wedding party. They all enter the house for the wedding banquet, and the door is shut. Now, a little later, the other girls come back, the ones who were not ready. They show up and pretty much demand that the door be opened. They say, "Lord, Lord, open the door to us." And he answers, "Truly, I tell you, I don't know you." I know it sounds harsh, but it's a reality. So if we recap, we talked about the parables we looked at last week. The parable right before this talks about bad behavior. The wicked servant who mistreats those in his charge, living for today. Unexpectedly, the master returns, finding him being disobedient while he was gone. The wicked servant thought he had time to get his act together, but he didn't. He wasn't ready. So this story tells us how not to live while waiting for Jesus. Now, the parable after this, the parable of the talents, tells us how we should live while waiting for Jesus. So he'll return finding us faithful, using our gifts, our talents, our abilities, our time, our money for the kingdom. But this parable here is simply about being ready. No specifics, no details, just be ready. Now, the 5 girls who were ready, they went into the banquet. But did you notice? All the girls basically looked the same. They all played the part. They were probably dressed pretty much the same. They all took their lamps. They all went to the assigned meeting spot, and they all waited. But only 5 of them were ready, yet you wouldn't know it by looking at them. See, Jesus is telling us what it's going to be like when he comes back. See, there will be people who profess to follow him, but have no real sense of what that means. They'll have no understanding of the depth of Christ's love, no real understanding of sin, no real understanding of what it means to be born anew, born again. There will be some in the church who never really took the time to know Jesus, who look ready by outward appearance, but never allowed God to transform their hearts, taking grace for granted. Now, I don't know exactly what being spiritually ready means for you. It's probably slightly different for each one of us. And Jesus certainly doesn't go into detail in this parable. His only point is be prepared. So if the parable before this tells us how not to live, not living for ourselves, indulging every desire at the expense of others. And the parable after this tells us how to live, using our gifts for God's glory. I want to suggest that the being ready in this parable starts and ends with relationship. Before we can live out our lives in accordance with God's will, before we can live lives of love, compassion, and obedience, we have to know the one whose will it is we're doing. And I'm going to leave you hanging again. I hope you come back tomorrow for more of the parable of the virgins. Have a good night.